Nobody seems to object. All right, so good morning, everybody. We are back with another set of API reviews. Let's start with this one here. Who wants to give us an overview?
Can you share the screen? We don't see what issues.
Yeah, what issue are you starting with?
Oh, sorry. So it's in the invite, and I think it should also pop up on YouTube any second now. Basically, what is shared right now by Jeremy. It is 45689 in the runtime repo. It's the add runtime API to load hot reload deltas.
Well, I guess I could speak on it, either me or Alexi, or both. I mean, I guess you just want kind of an overview. This is my first API review, actually. At the higher level, hot reload is the ability to basically change your code without actually using the debugger on the fly, and it involves a bunch of pieces, which it starts with like a watcher that uses Roslyn to get all the a file watcher or something to watch for edits in the project, then uses Roslyn to build these deltas based on on an assembly you're starting with, and then some IPC to send it to the target process that now calls this API to apply the edits. It's a lot like the API is a lot like the existing ENC debugger iCore debug apply changes or apply. I think it's called apply changes. There's iCore debug API. So it's similar to that, but it's in proc and it's of course managed. And that's the details of what we're proposing right now. And it's gone through a lot of discussion already in this issue. I mean, I did go into a lot of details, but I don't know if that's enough of an overview.
No, that makes sense. I think that's kind of what we're looking for. So I think now it's more like time for asking pointed questions. So do we actually, does this type already exist? I guess it does. Right? We already have try get raw metadata on assembly extensions today.
Actually, looks like we have two assembly extensions, one in reflection and one in ref metadata.
Yeah, because they're both extensions over assemblies, right? Yeah, I think that's that makes sense. So the design that you have right now is basically just talking about the metadata delta, IL delta, PDB delta. Why are there three different ones? Why is it not basically just one blob of delta?
Well, I guess that's just the way a delta is. I mean, it's sort of the actual deltas are, to me, they're kind of a black box that Roslyn gives us. I mean, the format isn't really, it's defined in Roslyn. I guess I haven't actually ever seen a spec for it. And it's just always been, divided up into metadata and IL and PDB. And so I don't know if I could go into any more details than that.
Yeah, I guess my question is more like, is that kind of like a fixed layout, or are we very likely to, eventually we add one more overload that has to take like a different kind of delta? But as long as we are confident that is the final shape you want, and we think span is good enough, then that seems like a fine API.
I assume that inside the blob it contains its own, like where the offsets, et cetera, are? Like it's its own patch structure?
Yeah. And as far as I know, I think it was asked even on the issue about the format of the delta, both the IL and the metadata. I don't know, it got defined a long time ago, and I really don't even have a history. And it's basically a contract between the runtime and and Roslyn. It's really all I can say on it.
Yeah, so long the format is pretty, it doesn't have to be super well known, but as long as it's well known as it's an established handshake we already have, I think that seems like a fine way of doing it. I mean, it is logically very similar to the other APIs we added, I think in the 5.0 4.5 time frame or whatever, because Roslyn wanted some IL emit APIs where they basically take raw bytes rather than the ref emit data structures. And that was all part of the normal ECMA 55 metadata already. So yeah, as long as there is a documented format and we are confident that the format itself doesn't change so much, I think it seems like a fine way of doing it.
Is there a more out of the way place that this can live? Like, if this is really only intended for the IDE, etc., it doesn't really need to be an extension method on a type that, yes, we don't want most people to be using assembly as a type, but if you're using reflection, it's there, and you probably don't actually care about this method.
It's already in the system reflection metadata namespace that, is kind of out of place. So we can kind of make it even more out of place, but, then it would probably need its own little type with nothing in it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like it's in the same kind of out of place category as the other API that we already added, right? Which is the get raw metadata or whatever.
Yeah, that's the thing. Look it up. Yeah, let's try to get raw metadata. Exactly.
Which
that's
seems.
We suggested it.
Yeah, I don't know who uses try get raw metadata, but I assume it's either the debugger or some other part of the normal VS tooling. So
No, it's primarily for Roslyn or for people who just want to, do their own low-level metadata. But the primary case for adding the try get raw metadata was Roslyn, the Roslyn interactive loop.
Oh, that's right, because they want to basically take the assembly and then just throw it into their own symbol reader rather than going through the assembly APIs. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that seems like it's a very similar use case, right? Like the normal reflection customer wouldn't care, but we put it in the reflection metadata where if you're in that namespace, you either care about the Roslyn or the low-level reflection metadata APIs, which, yeah, is what these things are for.
Chat suggests, and it sounds familiar to me, that the newest VS IntelliSense defaults are that it searches all referenced assemblies across all namespaces for extension methods, and this starts with A, so it'll be at the top. Like, I think if you have newest VS, it'll show up at the top.
I don't think it does anymore. So like you're saying that, so by default every extension method shows up. That I think they changed that. So when you now actually invoke IntelliSense, I don't think it shows extension methods from all namespaces by default. You have to either you can change the default obviously, or you have to click on this glyph that basically says across all namespaces or something. So by default it wouldn't show. Okay. It only would show things that you have usings for. But yeah, it's not hard to be able to do that. I think if you do Control J twice, I think then the first time you pop IntelliSense and the second time you basically put this into across all namespaces. So yeah, it would show up if people do that, which is not unheard of, but at the same time, I don't know, like the signature I think is discouraging enough, right? I mean,
that's
so an API
I mean,
you accidentally
really
call or something.
It's just one of those, like, is there somewhere other than an extension type and that you have to invoke it via, static call, and you have to really have been looking for it to find it. If we don't think that there's really a bad UX here, I'm just relaying questions from the chat in case no one's reading the text.
I came late, but why does it need to be an extension method? Why can't it just drop the this?
Well, if you do that now, you literally put it into everybody's face user's reflection, right?
No, it would be static method that takes assembly as the first argument. So you would have to type the whole thing, system reflection metadata assembly.extensions.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So it's not making an instance method, right? Like having it a static method somewhere. Sure.
Just the static method here, just drop the extensionness of it. I mean, extension methods are for ease of use of people calling it, and we don't want anybody calling this.
I guess you could. I mean, my question would be like, how is this different from the other one we already added, which takes a pointer, which is arguably worse than what this is doing. But I don't know. Like, I mean, I think practically if we do that, we probably have to find a type for this because you probably wouldn't want to put it on assembly extensions because it would be a weird place to put it.
Yeah, I mean the difference from try get raw metadata is the output format of that is in one of the ECMA docs. I don't know if this one is.
So to again speak about the format, right? We don't have the format explicitly documented, but it's basically an extension of the ECMA format. Right? Basically, like it would be kind of half a page to the ECMA spec to describe this format, basically referencing everything else from the ECMA spec. Right? So
fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the namespace, I don't think there's anything in it that we could put it on conveniently, so we would have to define a new type, which seems odd.
Why would we have to define a new type?
Well, because a type called assembly extensions, it kind of implies that it houses extension methods. I mean, that's part of the reason why Jeremy generally doesn't like extension methods being on a type called extensions, because it limits the ability to make static methods on that type. Because it's always weird.
Yeah.
Imagine enumerable would have been called enumerable extensions, right? And now you say enumerable extensions dot empty seems like a very weird way to call this API.
Yeah, but to be fair, if it's a slightly ugly user experience on a thing that we generally don't expect people to even want to call, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. I mean, in that case, I retract my earlier comment. It just seems weird to me that we have try get raw metadata as an extension method, and we have this one as a non-extension method. That just seems odd. I mean, it probably doesn't break anybody realistically, but it just seems like an odd choice.
What are the runtime guarantees on the patching here? Like, if you give it garbage, is your process just dead?
Yeah, actually, that's always been the case with ENC. We leave it up to Rosalind to really filter out the root edits. I mean, there is some checking on it. If the format is just way off or invalid, it'll return an error, which the API will throw an exception in. But in general, if it's what we call a root edit, if we leave that up to Rosalind to detect and not even call API. And that's always been the case. And there is edits that will cause your app to crash, basically. I know it's not a great user experience, but that's just what, where we're at with ENC, and we're kind of, using the same underlying mechanism.
Right, and this is really, I guess, part of the feeling that I have. That's what I expected, and it's the feeling that I have that's a little different between try get metadata, which is passive. You're asking for stuff and it's giving it to you, and this is an edit, and you call the edit and you give it gibberish, and now the process goes away. It just feels a little more like maybe it should be a little harder to call.
But it's not that different from assembly load file, right? Assembly load from stream, right? If you pass garbage to assembly load from stream, it will probably fail on bad file format exception. But if you kind of carefully craft the garbage, then your process will die as well because you will execute random code, right?
Yeah, given that you're asked to provide 3 byte arrays that have to pass some sort of validation at least to be applicable at all, like you would almost have to attack the process, right? It's not something where you pass in 3 innocent strings and then the process suddenly dies. You would have to go out of your way to make the process die here. Because, I mean, how do you get the byte arrays, right? Like, where do you get them from? Because if you take random byte arrays, it will probably just throw an exception and say, sorry, there's not a valid delta, right? So you would have to construct a delta somehow that is at least syntactically valid, and then find a way where, like, oh, this actually, makes the runtime crash. But the most likely case you would get those deltas is by going by the Roslyn APIs and asking for a delta, which, again, it's probably also not a 4-line exercise because I don't even know how you get an ENC patch from Roslyn, but I would assume it involves a fair amount of setup, right? So in that case, I don't care because, I mean, it doesn't seem like somebody can just easily call the API with garbage that would make the process die.
Okay.
So does anybody feel strongly about this? Should we leave it this, or do we not make it this? I mean, we can leave it off and later add it if we really wanted to, but it seems just odd to leave it off.
I think I slightly prefer the smell of having a non-extension method in a type named extensions, given that we don't expect people to call it, than the smell of this shows up in IntelliSense, ever. So I would prefer to not have this, even if we leave it on the assembly extensions type.
Works for me. Anybody else different opinion?
I agree with Jeremy.
Then let's just strip to this, and everything else stays the same, right? Same type, just a static method. All right. Any other questions?
Ship it. The YouTube stream is spinning. Are you still with us, Emo?
Yes, last time I checked, I am. Yeah, I can see it here.
Taking a real long sip of my coffee.
And you can talk through it. You've learned ventriloquism.
It's impressive, I know.
Yeah, it might be my internet actually, because Olya's on a call right now as well. I'm waiting for a moment where I get fiber, so I don't have that problem anymore. Alright, so then let me close this guy here, and then the second one I think was 47990, provide a way to get a pipe reader from a read-only sequence of bytes. I assume that would be...
I'll take it.
Okay, yeah, that works.
Cool. So the most similar API to this, and what this API is we have a read-only sequence of bytes, and we want a pipe reader to be built from that. Another existing API is pipereader.create from a stream. Instead of a stream, this takes a read-only sequence. It's also conceptually related to another API proposal, which was create a stream from a read-only sequence, but that's been backlogged for a while. So yeah, and if you guys are curious about the other issue, I can paste that in chat. But that's not what's up for review. So basically the purpose of this API is that when you're writing tests that use a pipe reader, and typically you're writing some sort of parser, you need to fill the pipe reader with data. And today you new up a pipe, and then you write the data to the pipe writer, and that's just a lot of ceremony. It's not very efficient, though that's not the most important thing, because the scenario for this is typically testing. But yeah, that's why we want it. It's just an easy way to take data that we already have in memory and read it as a pipe reader.
So to be clear, like what you're saying is, if we had a method that would take a sequence and give you a stream, then you could use that to create a pipe reader over that stream. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, you could do that. And it's also useful for people who just, assuming that you started with a read-only sequence and you want to stream, like, it's a similar concept, right? Like if you have parsing code that's written around stream, I don't think we want to create the intermediate. So like what you said is true. Like if we added read-only sequence as stream, then you could use pipereader.create that takes the stream, and then you'd end up with a pipe reader with even more indirection and less efficiency. But I think the direct conversion makes sense because pipereader.readAsync is going to return that read-only sequence exactly on the first read. And then based on how much you've like consumed and examined, subsequent reads might return some segment of it.
Yeah, that was my next question. So I would assume even if we had a method that would take a sequence and produces a stream, you would want, if you call, create pipe reader over that thing, you would hope that that method would somehow bypass the stream, right, and would just go straight to the underlying read-only sequence, right, which, might be possible because, we might be in the same assembly, so we might be able to see the actual types. But of course, that gets more complicated when people start wrapping streams and then give it to you because then you can't see through it. But that might be okay, right? I know they're opposed to having this API as well, but if we ever add the other API, it seems like we should also make sure we actually bypass the underlying stream if we can.
Yeah, that'd be nice to have, but as it stands, the read-only sequence as stream API doesn't exist yet, and I think for people who are using read-only sequences, using it together with pipe reader is one of the more common use cases.
Yeah, totally fair.
So yeah, I think this should exist, and this existing first is fine.
So let me think about it for a second.
So we're adding this basically as ease of use in a test, right?
Yeah, mostly. Yeah, that would be the primary scenario.
Yeah, so would a read-only memory overload at the same time make sense, which just creates this sequence for you, or is that hiding too, I don't think creating a read-only sequence from read-only memory is expensive, so it's not like that's a whole lot of work.
Right. Yeah, I think that's fairly straightforward. It's not something that I do super frequently. I will add that, even for non-test scenarios, if you already have a read-only sequence, this would be much more efficient than the workaround, which is feeding it back through the default pipe machinery. So while for single iron kestrel, we would only use this in tests right now. If you're in a scenario where you have a read-only sequence, having this pipereader.create method would be the most efficient way to read from it with your existing kind of pipe reader logic.
Fair enough. But, so similarly, if you have a read-only memory, then you want to create the read-only sequence and then pass it to this, and I just wonder if we should go ahead and add the other overload to avoid ceremony.
Maybe, yeah. So that goes more between... So I haven't, looked at all the read-only sequence constructors prior to this API review, because I didn't think we'd be talking about that. But, yeah, I'm not sure how difficult that is at the moment. Like you said, I don't think it's that difficult, and there's no, perf concern. The manual way of creating it, I'm sure, would be fine as far as performance goes, and I don't think it would be that difficult.
Okay. Yeah. We can add the one and add another later if somebody asks for it.
Yeah, I can imagine that we just have overloads that take, byte array or read-only memory directly, right? Because, if it's primarily for tests, presumably you have to shit as an array anyway.
Yeah, so that constructor already exists. I just checked, read-only sequence that takes a single read-only memory, so it should be fine.
Saying it should be fine to add an overload because there's not a whole lot of work, or it should be fine to leave out the overload because it's not a whole lot of work on the caller?
The latter.
Yeah, that's what I was
So leave out the overload is fine, yeah.
I don't have a strong opinion either way. I don't think we let byte arrays be implicitly converted into sequences.
I don't see an implicit conversion right now.
So.
Well, there's no implicit conversion, but there's a constructor that just takes the T array.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but if we had byte arrays allowed to be implicit to sequence, then adding a read-only memory overload in the future would be a compile-breaking change because now you would have two possible implicit conversion targets. We could solve that with more overloads, amusingly, but yeah. So as long as byte arrays can't go to sequence, we could add the read-only memory thing later, or but until then, somebody can just say pipereader.create a new read-only sequence of some read-only memory, and this isn't a type that everyone interacts with, so that seems fine.
Yeah. All right, so then I assume we're okay with the API as proposed.
Are there no other options on pipe reader that matter?
So yeah, that's the other thing to bring up. I would say no. So the pipereader.create from stream has some options like memory pool and so forth that aren't relevant when you already have the read-only sequence. So I cannot foresee any options that you'd be interested in since like the data is already segmented and so forth, and you don't need a pool. Yeah.
Sounds good.
So ship it.
Okay. All right, and that is done. All right, then the next one would be Jeremy's 24897 RFC 2898 derived bytes.
Yay.
Or Levi's for that matter.
Okay, so we have some very horribly named types in crypto. That's just a given. So the type RFC 2898 derived bytes, which is implements one of the two algorithms from RFC 2898. The other one's called password derived bytes. We did a great job there. Most people who use this type instantiate it, call it once asterisk, meaning sometimes they call it twice, and then dispose it. And it turns out like it's just a pure function, and so the proposal here is to add static versions of this function. The asterisk of when people call it twice is because we have an instance, the type basically runs as a stream. The more you call, so if you call get bytes one, that produces the same 2-byte sequence that it would if you called get bytes 2. As a static function, it wouldn't do that because it has no notion of previous position. The biggest point of contention is what in the world would we call the static method verb here, because the good names are taken by the instance.
So as for the scenario, in ASP.NET, we actually call this function quite a bit. And if you're calling the regular streamified function that Jeremy mentioned earlier, where you instantiate the type, call get bytes, and then dispose of it, you're paying the cost of the internal instance to maintain all of that state for you, even though you don't need the state because you're just going to call it once and then be done with it. These static methods are considerably faster than the instance methods because the static methods don't attempt to maintain that state. They just say, oh, you're calling me, I'm doing work, and then I'm just throwing everything out. So everything just ends up in a temporary buffer, basically. Like, we see crazy performance gains when we do one-shots like this.
Yeah, and I have a note at the top of this that basically there are two main functions that are there's one main function being proposed, which is it's PBKDF2 of a password assault, an iteration count, a hash algorithm, and an output length. That varies of the password is bytes or a string. If it's a string, we assume UTF-8, but the algorithm actually runs over bytes. And then it's and spanify all of that. So while it looks like there's a lot of things being proposed, it's really one thing's being proposed with one overload and then spanified.
Yep.
Sorry, the one thing you lost me on is you said like the good name is taken by the instance. So what is the good name that you would like to use?
Well, the name that the instance has is get bytes, which maybe is not the super best of names, but there we have get bytes, derive key, derive, like there are a lot of names that we could come up with, and in the discussion on this, no one had a good name, so Kevin threw up this straw man, and I shrugged and put it in the proposal.
So, but I mean, So why would get bytes not work? Because I mean, you can overload between instance and static, right? And it would not have the same signature, right? You would just, I mean, get bytes takes an int, right? This one would take like 5 arguments, right?
I feel like we generally don't mix static and instance overloads in the same method group.
We do only when they do the exact same thing, and these don't do the exact same thing, so it's a bit weird.
But why do you care? Because I mean, at a given point in time, the user only sees one of them, right? Because you either invoke it on a static or on an instance, right? And if you, I think on an instance, I don't think you see statics in IntelliSense. And so same thing applies, that if you invite it as a static, you wouldn't see the instance one. So at any given point in time, the user would only ever see get bytes, and it either takes an int or it takes 5 arguments, right? Which, I mean, if it effectively does the same thing, it's, I mean, it kind of does and it kind of doesn't, whether one of them is streamed, the other one is not, but like,
yeah,
that's
the first
more
call is the same.
Yeah, and I think fundamentally, like, if you invoke it as a static, it kind of makes sense that it's not streamed, so I think it's kind of obvious from the use side which behavior you're getting, so I don't think you would be super confused. I mean, it certainly seems weird to call a static method, you know, I mean, the call set basically now becomes RFC 289 blah derived bytes dot peekable of derived bytes, like, I don't know, I mean, calling it get bytes is not going to make this prettier, but like it certainly makes it a little bit less ugly.
So coming back to what Jeremy had mentioned earlier, RFC 2898 actually defines a whole suite of algorithms. Of that suite, PBKDF2 is one member of the algorithm family. In theory, we could add the other 3 or 4 algorithms onto the same type in the future, and the naming would actually make sense. We would call them PBKDF1 derived bytes or PBMac1 dot, generate hash or something like that. And they all fall under the auspices of RFC 2898. Granted, I don't ever see us doing that, to be honest. I'm just straw manning.
Would it make sense to just call it get PBKDF2? Or would that make no sense?
Or just, I mean, honestly, PBKDF2 is the name of the function in the spec. We could just call it PBKDF2.
Yeah, to me it's kind
Why
of...
don't we just make it its own type?
Make a new type name that does the same thing as the existing type?
Except for it would be like a more modern implementation, one that we would basically tell people, like, if you don't need to use the RFC 2898 derived bytes type at all, don't use it. Use this other thing instead that is better, faster. We can give you a better implementation.
I mean, basically you would basically say there's a type called PBKDF2 and then it has a method called derived bytes, and then if you have the other algorithms would just be other types, basically.
Correct. By the way, that ASP.NET already ships this as a public function, and the type name is, in fact, PBKDF2.
I mean, that's not horrible.
I guess once we're talking about net new types, which, sure. I mean, we could also do key derivation as the type.
So,
and then
sorry, I need to correct myself. Jeremy's actually right. In ASP.NET, the static class is key derivation, and the method name is PBKDF2.
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't even looking at that. That was just independent. It's apparently the obvious thing.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, like, I mean, all of these are, degrees of ugly, but I think to me what really makes it ugly here is that even if you bind to the algorithm names, it just seems weird to say derived bytes twice. That's kind of the thing that just, if we just say, okay, let's just drop derived bytes from the method names here and just call it PBKDF2, I think that seems reasonable because at least you don't say the same thing twice, right? You don't stutter when you call the API.
Yeah, so I think in the notes that are just off the top of the screen, that is when I was like, here are the reference signatures, I had just called it PBKDF2 in that one. In general, we would say that's not a good name, but calling it password-based key derivation function 2 is also not a good name. PBKDF2 is literally the name of the algorithm, and like everything else in crypto, like we don't write out hash-based message authentication code for HMAC. We're like, no, it's HMAC. In fact, most people don't even know what the things stand for.
Yeah, I mean,
Like
that makes
math.
sense to me too.
I mean, we'd have the fun, how do we feel like casing it, all caps or just capital P, but
Honestly, casing is less of a problem because if you know about the algorithm and you just search it, I mean, search is usually case insensitive, right?
mhm.
So in that sense, I
Yeah.
think that's probably more important than, because if we actually spell it out, then God help you with finding the well-known term, right?
Indeed. Yeah, so I guess the real question then is if we're just going to name it as a static verb PBKDF2, do we want to make a new type to hold it called key derivation, or do we want to put it on the existing type because people who know where to look for it already know where to look for it?
I don't care, quite frankly, and I think if I mean, the docs will help you, right? If you just search for PKDF2 now, it will show up, right? So it probably doesn't matter too much. I mean, this doesn't strike me as the thing where you would start in IntelliSense. Maybe you do, but like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the people who find this type only find it because, Stack Overflow told them
Yeah.
RFC 2898 derived bytes is the answer for PBKDF2.
So in that case, I mean, I think putting in the existing types works for me. I mean, I don't know enough about RFC 2898 to know whether that's a good type name, but it seems a bit weird to say, like, if that is housing a bunch of algorithms, it would be more logical to put it on this type than introducing a separate type, because then it's like, well, why are the algorithms on this one but not that one? And the answer is, well, because one can stream, the other one can't. It seems like a weird split. I think now doing static, non-static makes a little bit more sense.
Levi, out of curiosity, do you know what else is on the key derivation type from ASP data protection?
Just PBKDF2. That's it.
Okay. Yeah, like I think if we get to a point where we're either adding other things from, I guess if we're adding just other things from RFC 2898, we can keep putting them on the same type. But if we start adding more static one-shots, then maybe we would just take the hit of, there's two ways of doing this, and see also reflection. And duplicate it. But I'm happier to keep it to not add a new type at this point. So then just rename all these methods to PBKDF2.
Yep.
Okay. So I don't have any other thoughts on the naming them other than strip derived bytes from the name.
So in terms of the actual methods you're proposing, my understanding is that the first three, I guess, are all... No, sorry, the first two are basically giving you new data back, and then the third one is basically the normal pattern that we have to do it span-based. And then same is true for the second three, and the difference there is just instead of taking them as spans, we just take them as strings, I guess.
Sorry, there's a scroll. All right, now I have it on my screen. Okay.
Yeah,
so
I think the first three are supposed to be arrays and the last three are supposed to be spans, I think.
Yeah, looking at it, it seems more like the first three are all dealing with the password being bytes, and the last three are all dealing with the password being text, and then you have the version, take a byte array versus take a span, and then, do it in place versus give me back a new byte array, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the first overload is password is bytes and take arrays, produce arrays. The second is password a byte is bytes, take spans, and produce an array. The third is take spans, write to a span, which means we don't need the output length anymore because we'll just fill the destination. And then the third three are like the first three, except the password is a string or string-like. So string and then roschar.
So one question I have is on the one that doesn't return a new array, is that the right shape? Like what happens if the destination isn't large enough?
there's no such thing as the destination not being large enough. The destination can be too small. 0 makes no sense. But the algorithm can, I feel like it runs up to 2 to the 53 minus 1 bytes. So longer than you can have a span with the current version of .NET.
So maybe I misspoke, but basically what I meant is like what happens if the destination is not large enough. Like basically, like how do you know that you need to allocate more in the destination in order to run the algorithm?
There's no concept of that in these algorithms. These algorithms can all generate a variable number of bytes where the caller controls how many output bytes there are. So the pattern here is the length of the span that you pass in is the number of bytes that you want generated.
Oh, I see. So if I give it 4 bytes, it will generate 4 bytes. If I give it 1,000 bytes, it will fill 1,000 bytes. So it's all, like any size is valid basically?
Yeah. And in fact, if you called the static first with 4 and then, or with a span of length 4 and then with a span of length 1,000, the second call, the first 4 bytes would be the same as the first call.
Gotcha.
Because the function takes a password as bytes, a salt, an iteration count, a hash algorithm, and the number of bytes to produce. So in the span writing one, we just take span.length as the number of bytes to produce. That way we don't have the silly, give me a destination, comma, give me a length. I'm sorry, the length you gave me is bigger than the span. So destination.length is an implicit parameter.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or an implicit input.
And then presumably if you ever cared about supporting UTF-8, it would just add its new set of overloads that takes, well, I guess can we actually, because the byte one is already taken, right?
I mean, so it depends on what you mean for UTF-8ness. The thing that we do with the text right now is we run it through encoding.utf8, and then we call the byte one, because the algorithm is only defined on bytes. The reason we expose the byte one is platform compatibility with, if someone somewhere had a PBKDF2 that used Unicode instead of UTF-8, then you wouldn't be able to replicate that with.
Yeah, I guess my question is, if somebody wants to give you the password as text, and they happen to use UTF-16, then the existing text one makes sense. If they happen to have it in UTF-8, then there would be a functional difference between, converting that UTF-8 string to a byte array versus treating the UTF-8 string as a byte array, right?
Well, they would turn it into a byte array themselves, wouldn't they? Encoding .whatever.get bytes, and then call the byte overload.
Yeah, and if you're talking about for the theoretical UTF-8 string type, then as long as that can map into bytes via some mechanism, then you would just call the bytes one.
I see. Yeah, well, I was more thinking about performance, right? Like if we wanted to optimize the UTF-8 case, then presumably we would like to have a method that takes that directly. But yeah, my point was just that bytes is already taken, but I guess that's just the nature here. So we would have to have something.
But again, because our default handling of text is UTF-8, if you have a UTF-8 based string, that's just called a bytes one.
Yeah.
Is that the same thing?
It would pass through.
Yeah. Literally, the implementation of the one that takes string password is call the one that takes byte array with encoding.utf8.get bytes.
Sure.
Unless Levi wins the implementation argument, and it calls the version of the UTF-8 encoder that throws if you give it gibberish.
The performance will be the same in either case.
Yeah.
All right, then.
All right, so are we naming it all caps PBKDF2?
I mean, all caps does violate our naming conventions, but whatever.
So does.
Well, I just named it like what was proposed, except I removed the derived bytes from the method name.
Okay, that's fine. I don't. They're both ugly, so I don't care.
Yeah, to me the casing one is like I just think practically speaking casing wouldn't matter because you would find it if you just search for it, and yeah, I mean IntelliSense will fix if you don't have it. It just seems weird to go all caps here, unless somebody feels strongly. But it's crypto, so either one will work, right?
I'm still putting my foot down on if it's 3 or more characters in an acronym, it's first letter capitalized only unless it's a proper noun,
Yeah,
at which point
works
it
for
all
me.
goes capitalized. Because that's been our naming convention in the past, and we violate it all over the place.
Yep.
All right then. Next one. This one would be 42784, which is allow setting the activity properties after activity creation and before starting and when using activity source. That is probably text, would be my guess.
Yes. So for this one, if you remember, we have activity source class, which has overloads. Is called start activity, and start activity is just creating and starting the activity in the same time. So if you call this start activity, you will not have any chance to do anything before. Before starting the activity. We got the scenario that some people need to make sure that if the activity started, if the activity created, so they will have a chance to add some stuff to the activity before starting it. So when firing the start event, people will get the full information there. And they want to try to avoid the cost of creating this extra stuff that you want to add the activity after creating it, before that ensuring that the activities get created. So basically the proposal here is introducing this create activity API on the activity source, which will be exactly the same as start activity, except that it will just create the activity and not starting it.
I see.
And of course, create activity will go through the sampling mechanisms that we have already with the start activity. So the parameters we're passing here, it will go through the listeners, and the listeners at the end will decide if they need to create the activity or not. So it's possible that somebody call create activity and they got null if nobody interested to create such activity.
So one question I have is that the existing activity, start activity overload, there's 4 overloads, and you're proposing 2. Why did you pick the 2 that you picked?
Those are the basic 2. This is what we started with start activity also. We started with this 2, which is taking these parameters that needed for the sampling only. So we don't have any other overload we need for such case so far. The only difference between these 2 overloads that proposed is parent context. So one of them is taking activity context and the other one is taking string. And we have to support both because we are encouraging people to use activity context in general, but in the HTTP cases, the HTTP header will have just a string, so they need the other overload that takes string.
Isn't the most recent overload for start activity the one that had a default member name?
Yes, and we talked about that, and we think that default caller member name is not needed for this scenario.
So that if people want to be messing with options, they probably want something other than the caller member name as the name?
Yeah.
And the reason is because you assume that whoever creates an unstarted one, that's infrastructure, so the member where they happen to be in is not the correct one?
Yeah. Other point here about the naming. So I'm proposing create activity, but some other people saying that we should be explicit about the naming, telling no, this will create activity that is not started, which is, if you look in the comment, they propose create unstarted activity name instead of create activity. But my point here is the other overload is called start activity, which is explicit telling we are starting activity if you call the other methods. And here it's called create activity, which is also kind of like telling like it's just create activity but not starting it. So I'm fine either way, but I just want to tell about like other people prefer the more explicit name telling like it's unstarted activity.
So my feeling is that we should use the overload from the newest start activity, the one that kind is the only parameter, the only required parameter, because if they want a different name, they can specify it, and it will save when someone asks for well, why can't I have everything except the kind defaulted like I could with start? I just want to create it and set two things on it and then call start. Why do I have to go completely rewrite the call? So I think we should just use whichever pattern we think is the right one for start, which presumably is the newest one, and use that as the basis.
The other one, which is for the start, was taking the name as a last parameter, right?
Yes.
Which is like, this will not be the normal cases here. I mean, most of the people creating the activity here has to pass the name anyway.
I mean, yeah, using named parameter binding, they could pass kind, comma, name, colon, the name. If you think that that's what everyone's going to do, then, and it's a different scenario, then sure, I guess. It's just you have three required parameters on this one, and you decided on the start that you only needed one required parameter. You defaulted parent context to null, but you didn't hear.
Right.
And you can't, because then there's if both the one that takes a string and the one that takes an activity context default them to null, then there's ambiguity of target. Of course, if only one of them takes it as null, then...
That's right.
So I guess really my concern is, even if you want name to be a required parameter in create instead of start, you've changed whether or not parent context is a required parameter from the newest overload to start.
Right.
So maybe I simply think we should, on the first of the new proposals, on the one that takes activity context, parent context, maybe we should just default that one to null. And now you have a two parameter version, and then they can be expanded as needed. And then I don't know if this is worth actually creating the proper overload that doesn't have any of the default arguments. That is the recommendation once you have either two or more than two. I don't remember what we said, but two was the boundary case. Off by one error is
yeah.
a thing. But we didn't do that for start, so maybe we don't need to for create. I don't know how user-friendly these APIs are supposed to be.
Yeah, I think in the even we don't have a default parameters here. I mean, at least for the parent context or kind, they still can pass the default values. So they can just specify. Yeah.
Well, it's simply we've learned from usability studies that there are people who get confused when IntelliSense shows them that there are default parameters, like all the square braces and the signature being very long, and that's why we have a I don't remember what strength of guideline it is, probably a consider, that once you have two or there's more than two parameters that are defaulted, that you make a proper overload that just gets rid of all the default parameters. So in that case, it would be create activity, string name, comma, activity kind, int signature, and then it just calls one of these longer ones.
Okay, so it still would be just two overloads proposed, right? Or more than that?
Well, if you still want, parent context to vary based on string versus activity context, then I think I'm just saying take the two you have, and then add a third overload of create activity that's just string name and activity kind, and then that uses a null parent context, no tags, and no links.
Okay, this sounds fine with me.
So I'm still looking at the overloads. I'm trying to figure out what you just said. So can you repeat slowly what was the proposal that you just had?
So add a third version of create activity.
Okay.
That takes string name and activity kind as its only parameters.
And so you drop all the other ones, or you make them default? No, you drop them all, right?
This is the simplified overload with no defaults to make IntelliSense cleaner.
Gotcha. So that would be the first one probably we want to have on the list then.
And then it means we don't have to pick which of the activity context type or the string type for parent context gets defaulted to null, because we solved it with a simplified overload.
Fair enough. That works for me. All right, so I assume that's everything we have done. Any other questions?
Yeah. Do you have any opinion about the name, create activity against create unstarted activity?
I mean, I kind of agree with what you said, Tarek, because if you see create and start next to each other, I think it will be obvious.
Okay.
I mean, if unstart could be a verb, that would be probably preferred, but like it would be, you can't really do that, right? You can't say unstart activity. That would be very, very weird. So, create unstarted activity seems overly verbose. So,
if the activity source type had like 80 members on it, create and start would be far enough apart that there may be room for confusion if somebody does the dot and then just starts, hitting down. But I think there's only 5, so create and start are pretty much always guaranteed to both be visible to you. So I think create activity is a sufficient name.
Okay, sounds good.
Works for me. So then let's just mark this and scroll all the way down.
I will point out my reasoning does not hold up to the test, or could not hold up to the test of time. We could add 80 members to activity source, and then, but I don't see it being very confusing since we explicitly used start for the one that created a started activity.
Alrighty. Then I think the next one is 43853, which is impossible to set activity ID format when using activity source.
Yeah. For this one, the proposal here is just adding extra parameter for the overload that we exposed during 6. I mean, it's a new exposed overload, so I think we have the freedom to change it a little bit. So basically, we are adding what we call it ID format to it, and this will give the ability to choose the ID format inside the activity while creating and starting it. Just to tell you about in the form, I mean, the activity can have two types of formats. I mean, for the IDs, I mean, one is called W3C, which is the standard, and the other is called the hierarchical. And unfortunately, I mean, in .NET Core, the default is the W3C because this is what we need the direction moving forward. And then the full framework, the default is the hierarchical. So we have different defaults. So the request here is to have the ability while creating the activity to specify the specific format. So you ensure that getting that specific format while creating the activity. Also, to tell more about, like, we have a static method, which is you can set the global state for the format. I mean, you can specify the global format for the whole process. But the request here is actually it's coming from Babel, if I remember, that they want not to mess with the global state of the process, and instead of to have more control over the activity creation to specify the ID format. So the proposal here, nothing new more than just the green line that we adding this extra parameter for this overload that we already exposed today in .NET 6.
Do we need to go back to the previous issue and add it to the calls to create, or is this something that someone would just set as a property after they call create?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, for the other one, for the create, they can add the format after creating it before starting the activity. So they can do that. So we don't have to add it to the parameters there. But for here, I mean, like, you know, it's important to add it here because, like, if you start the activity, you will not have a chance to set the ID format at that time. Pavel was raising his hand, I believe. He has some comments.
Yeah, so technically, it's enough for us to have that overload from the previous issue, because then we can change the activity ID format to whatever we want and start the activity later. But
okay.
the question is, like, if we didn't forget about it and didn't keep the default format in the previous release, would we ever do hierarchical for this new feature? Like, hierarchy activity source is the way forward with tracing, and W3C is the way forward with headers. So I wonder if we should make a break. I know it's a forbidden word in this meeting, but, like, does it ever make sense to create activity source activity with the hierarchical format?
Yes, I mean, like, actually we were discussing another issue a couple of days ago regarding ASP. They want to migrate to use activity source instead of manually creating the activity, and part of it they are getting the parent from the HTTP header, and they will not be ensuring, like, you know, what they are getting. It will be always W3C. I mean, it can be hierarchical. So I think yeah, I mean, like, moving forward, I mean, we should recommend W3C all the time, but we, in the same time, I think we should still support the old hierarchical ID if anybody needs it.
So now we do with the previous proposal. Can we switch the default to always be W3C?
In the full framework?
Yeah.
This would be breaking change that we evaluated before, and we said we cannot take this breaking change. I mean, like, it will be much bigger breaking change for the full framework.
Well, the previous proposal create method is, I guess, is this a NuGet package or is this inbox? It
gets installed with the .NET Framework inbox, but it's a NuGet package that anybody can reference it from all the applications.
Because, like, the activity source.create activity API is completely new.
Right.
If it wanted to always use W3C instead of using the global, that would, like, you had to change your code. You should have tested it.
Yeah, I was kind of more worried about putting people that use our Hello World mainline API into the pit of success on all frameworks. But I get that it's a breaking change.
But let me just understand what you're proposing. You're not proposing to break an API. You're proposing that the default behavior is different, correct?
Yeah, I'm proposing that with a system diagnostic source 6.0, behavior of start activity changes to have W3C header by default. And you can use the workaround of using create activity to set the old format.
I mean, it's never ideal to break behavior, but I think those are the kind of things that I do think we can entertain on core. like if we believe that the vast majority of people will want the new behavior, like I think it's not unreasonable to say when you're on 6 you get that new behavior, and if you don't want it, go in main and change the static default or set some other
But
flag that you want to do.
It's not on core. It's a NuGet package. So this would be changing the behavior on framework of a type that you were already using.
Right. Sure, but it's the same thing, right? Because if you upgrade the package, you get a new version. If you have an existing package reference, the behavior won't change unless you update the package.
No, if your package closure upgrades your package, you get a behavior change.
But that means you have to upgrade something, right? So the concern is always when you like the problem with full framework is really the in-place update thing where you haven't really done anything and then suddenly your app has new behavior, right? If you had to rebuild your app or upgrade some package, I mean presumably you test before you ship that shit to customers, right? And if you don't, then well.
Fair enough. I guess that's true. You do still have to have changed something. It's an unrelated break, but you did have to change something. It's not just the behavior changed or simply recompiling with no changes caused a behavior change, but you had to make a change, and then now it behaves differently.
Yeah, and even if you really wanted to, like you could change the default in the NuGet package to say, well, if you're building full framework, we'll leave it on the old behavior unless you opt into the new one. If you happen to build against core, then we retroactively opt into the new behavior, right? I mean, we could make it targeted if we really wanted to.
So this is the behavior today. I mean, like it's as I mentioned about the default for .NET Core is the W3C, which is what we're doing, and if you're using it for the full framework, the default will be hierarchical at that time, which is the original default since we introduced this package.
I see. So then what Pavel said is what we already do then.
Yes.
No. I want the default for the new API also be W3C even on .NET Framework. That's what I'm saying. Like .NET Framework is the last holdout where we still default to W3C sometimes.
I see.
And I'm saying in this new API, that's the way forward, and we just added. Can we like switch to the new best thing?
I mean, from a breaking change policy, I don't think that's insane. Because as I said, we hold a very high bar for in-place updates, but it seems to me a new version of a package could change behavior. It's the problem will be in practice that how discoverable is that if you do a minor, we better bump some, at least the minor version or something, really the major version for the package, but I'm not sure how much people understand that meant that something has changed, right? Versus if you retarget your app between .NET Core versions, it's kind of more clear that what you're getting is a bigger delta, right?
Just to give you some context, OpenTelemetry comes and changes the entire global static default for all APIs, like in its static constructor. So like on practice, people most of the time would get something else that would switch the default. But yeah, it's okay. I was just entertaining the idea.
Yes. Okay, so yeah, I would say we shouldn't go with the breaking changes, and we should stick with what we have here.
Do we need this at all then? Like if we have create activity?
Yeah, this is the question. I mean, like we added this one only, because like the coding pattern will be easier to just create and start activity in same time and specifying the ID. So you don't have to call create activity and later you call start on it.
Pavel, in the Azure SDK usages of this, which I assume is what the concern is, are you using caller member name as your activity name?
Our usage is very deep into our utility code, so we don't really care about how nice the API is.
Because the difference would be, this of why we may want this is the start. Adding the ID parameter here is the only thing you wanted to change between create and start was the ID parameter. So this is still a caller convenience, but
that's right.
If callers aren't really getting the convenient syntax benefit because they're specifying everything, they may as well do it in 3 lines. So it's modifying an existing thing to add more tweakables, it seems fine to me. But if you yourself don't want it, then I'm fine with saying no.
Yeah, I'm with Jeremy. Like, I mean, given that the API is just added, I'm fine with adding, as many things as you want in the middle. But if we don't need it, we don't need it, right? So it's really up to you.
So let me say that, like, if we had the previous proposal, I wouldn't file this issue. And outside of that, look at it as you like.
Okay, so you are fine, I mean, like to use create activity.
Yep.
Okay, so I would say we shouldn't go with this then.
All right, so you're saying we shouldn't take this one?
Yes, we will not take this one, yes.
And your rationale is because we have the create activity API now?
That's right, yes, exactly. And Bubble was fine with create activity to use.
All right, then let's do that. Actually, let me paste the whole thing just for context. All right. So the next one is 44738. Make it safe and easier to build an X500 distinguished name. I guess that's, yep, that's VCS Jones. That means that's Jeremy.
Yep. What was the number again?
44738.
Okay, so we talked about this one in the past. So there's, in the top post, there's a previous proposal version. When Kevin was implementing it, he found out that because of some package structure and layering and the shared framework, it's currently really expensive to expose system formats ASN1 types through the X509 certificates ref. Like, the two refs don't want to be in the same place at the same time. So instead of before where we had like add email address, which took an email address and an optional encoding type, we've simplified it such that all of the easy to use methods now just take the string value. And if you want to do something complicated, there's the add OID or OID value, and then a nested enum of which encoding type do you want, and there are only really 4 options. So like we were overly we were going to throw on a lot of inputs from the previous one. This one is like these were really the only legal inputs anyway, and we did it as nested because we don't expect anyone to really ever call it outside of, me, Kevin, and maybe Levi for writing tests. So.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of like if for things like struct helpers that are part of the pattern, I think it's fine for each because people never have to issue the type name, but it is a bit weird to say X509 distinguished name builder dot encoding type, but it's quite a mouthful to type, right?
It is, but again, I don't expect anyone will ever really want it, which means we could decide straight up to remove it, but Kevin did convince me that if of the epsilon people who do want it, the nested enum is ugly and the steepness of the curve of you want to do it on your own is unfortunate. So this is a little bit of ugly for the 0.1% to make it so they don't just shoot themselves in the foot while trying to do it.
Sure. I mean, looking at the namespace, I mean, if you propose a top level type name, that would be fine with me too. Like if you call it, I don't know, X509 distinguished name encoding or something, it seems also fine. I mean, the namespace is full with types called X509 something, so having one more in there is not going to make it or break it.
Personally, I would rather not have it than have it as another top level type.
Sure.
Because the encoding types aren't really part of distinguished name builder. They really come from ASN1, and so they're really system formats ASN1 universal type number. But since we can't expose that via the ref, it's here's the limited subset that were the only legal values, and for this context, and like now you don't need to go work with the ASN writer yourself.
So,
but I think that the API usage 5 years from now, you'll see maybe 2 hits at most on NuGet of the ones that take the.
What is the underlying type that this actually needs? A string, an int, or like what is actually written into it?
Well, the numbers that are here actually do get written into it, but these are the enum is used as a switch on a set of encoding classes that are internal to system formats ASN1 for formatting things according to the way that strings are formatted in ASN1. The easiest one is UTF-8 because that's UTF-8. I guess BMP is Unicode that can't leave the basic multilingual plane. Sorry, UCS2. Yes, BMP string is UCS2. Teletext is something weird. Printable string is ASCII, and it throws if you use a control character. And yeah, they're all simple encodings, but the thing that you're testing is if I use the ASN encoding type printable string and I recover this after sending it to my partner, do they crash because they couldn't handle a printable string? Like, this is really, except for complicated interrupt things, this is really a test generator method.
I mean, if we don't really care about the enum, like, why would we just take it as an int and then just say, yeah, we only support the values 0, 12, 19, 20, and 30, and if you need anything else, then too bad, file a bug. Like, if you really think it's just a very super advanced pass-through API where somebody wants to do something super advanced, then might as well just take an int, right? You know what I mean? Like, at that point, it just becomes a...
Fair enough. It's a little more awkward to document, but I guess that's fair.
Like, I don't know. Like, to me, the value of a nested type is just so low if you need to ever utter it, that it seems just... It's just so weird. Like, at that point, like, an int with like a well-known set of values is almost more logical than a nested type.
I mean, that's fair. And then the caller would just, if they reference system formats ASN1, they would just cast universal type number to.
For example, yeah.
To int. So. I guess I'm okay with that. It smells, but it's a power API, and the Win32 equivalent would just be something like DW tag ID. So.
Yeah. Like, it seems like the vast majority of people would just use the methods, right, which seems fine. And
yeah. Okay.
all right, then let's do that. Let me just now find the browser window again. See, I can also do ugly.
Yeah. Can you clarify once more, Jeremy, who's asking for this?
Kevin.
So the reason I asked is like right now, like the simple fact is everyone just uses Bouncy Castle for stuff like this, and I'm curious as to what qualifies this for inclusion in the core SDK.
So yeah, I mean, really, the scenario would be you're using the certificate request API, where we can take either a string or the X500DN, sorry, the string version of the X500DN or the X500 distinguished name object, and especially once you end up with the possibility of having quotes inside, people mess up the X500DN building, and so it's making it easier to use certificate request. Like that would be the 99% scenario.
Sure. So the argument then would come down to like this type really makes using another type that we already ship far easier.
Yeah.
Okay.
Most people that are using certificate request just pass cn equal localhost, but once you're doing something more complicated than that, then this helps you build it in such a way that you don't have a ambiguous parse or any other such problem.
Okay, yeah, because I see that Kevin wrote that at the very beginning of the issue as well, but I was having a little bit of trouble understanding how this tied back to existing framework functionality. Okay, I buy it.
All right, then that one is also done. Now we are at 47525. Developers can have access to more options when configuring async awaitables. I think this one is Eric's.
Hey, that's mine indeed. So basically, this proposal stems from like many requests to basically be able to add more options when configuring awaitables, task awaitables in particular. So primarily, should I just wait until you're done, Nemo?
Sorry, like I'm listening. I'm just copy pasting stuff over.
The sharing is on a delay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Emo's streaming to YouTube. I'm retransmitting to YouTube on Teams, so there's a lag.
Yeah.
What's the order?
And apparently I even fell off of real time, so now I'm back to only about a 4-second delay.
Okay. I mean, Emo, if you feel like it, I can keep going.
Yeah, just keep going. Eventually we'll catch up.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so basically we've had like many requests from people to be able to expose further options when configuring task awaitables. Currently, the only option we're exposing is a flag to basically disable capturing the current context. So this is basically adding a bunch of more things. So first of all, it gives users the ability to pass a cancellation token, specify a timeout, and then we have a few other options, for example, suppressing exceptions, forcing asynchrony when the, always sort of execute the continuation asynchronously, and of course the existing continue on captured context parameter. Might be worth pointing out that the cancellation token requirement stemmed from a request to provide a task combinator that accepts a task and a cancellation token that gives back a task that has cancellation. And we kind of decided to not do that and instead work on the awaitable level because I guess in that case the API more clearly communicates the fact that it is the awaitable we're canceling rather than the task itself, which people might reasonably expect that for some reason. So the core of the proposal is basically exposing a new struct called await behavior, whose default parameters when you create a default instance are as specified, and then you can just set a bunch of parameters and call a configure await overload that accepts that struct. I guess there are points to be made about this is basically the core of the proposal, but I guess there are points that can be made about the semantics of the individual parameters. So,
Before we get into the individual parameters, can I just ask, is there a reason we prefer this configure await struct as opposed to like separate extension methods? Does it enable like new capabilities or allow these things to be written in a better way?
So there's two things you might be asking. One of them is what about just lots of different overloads of configure await that take various combinations? Or you might be asking about sort of the with cancellation with timeout method that takes one of these things and produces a new task. Is there one of those that you're asking about or something else?
Both actually. So yeah, I'm interested.
So for the former, one of the reasons we sort of went this way was just the sheer number of combinations here that are relevant, or one overload that ends up having just a ton of optional parameters. And so kind of at that point you kind of you just have a struct and you can specify them all, or whichever ones you want, and also add to it over time. If there are additional options we want to add, we can add them here. The fact that we're jumping from 1 to 5 suggests there's probably going to be a 6th at some point, and so at that point we don't have to add another overload, we can just add another property to the struct.
I should point out, sorry.
Okay, and then just to say, for the with one, there's sort of two issues. One is it forces you to create a new task, which may or may not be what you want. And the second is it's whereas, take cancellation token, for example. By passing it to configure await, it's pretty clear that you're configuring the await operation itself with cancellation. Whereas if you say task.with cancellation, there's a fear that it suggests that you're actually canceling, like you're somehow modifying that task to be able to cancel it. And so there's sort of a user experience aspect of, we want to make it clear that that's not happening.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned with this, that a consumer of this API might confuse that this is applying to the await itself and not to the actual operation that you call the method on.
It is applying to itself.
It is applying. So if we use a stream.write, we could pass this in, and the cancellation token would be routed into the actual IO call.
It's applying to the await, not to the other thing.
Yeah. Okay, so I understood it correctly. So I'm a little concerned that someone using this API might confuse that and put their cancellation token in the wrong place.
I think that's a valid concern that comes with this type of API, but on the other hand, I believe everybody has at some point found the need to do this. And in fact, we actually do that in our own tests. Like we have helper methods in our tests that implement exactly that thing. And, I've had good reasons to use this in the past. So, I mean, there is this risk, right?
Is there another way you'd expect it to be exposed that's less confusing, Corey?
I almost wonder if we name it something other than configure await. I do know, yes, these are valid use cases, but I think the message that we tell people is your operation itself should support cancellation. It should support timeouts, and I just worry that exposing this in such a easily viewable standard place would confuse people and perhaps cause them to, have very inefficient cancellation that just leaves an operation hanging out there, that sort of thing.
So of course we want the underlying operations to accept the cancellation token, and we obviously want to be able to pass it there. I'm struggling from a user experience perspective to understand the confusion though with the await aspect. Like it's the whole config. The reason the name configure await was actually chosen a decade ago was because of the idea that we wanted to make it clear someone was actually configuring the await, the actual wait operation, and not the underlying task. I'm struggling to come up with a way that makes that any more clear.
No, I understand. I just know that this is something people have trouble with today, And if we add something that increases confusion, that concerns me.
I get it. I mean, I think, we don't want to make it more confusing. On the other hand, we know that lots of people do this in a lot of places. In fact, the number one use of task.oneany is to implement this. And
what's more,
they do it wrong.
Exactly.
I mean, have we explored what this would look like with a series of helper methods on top of, static methods on task rather than?
And it ends up being like with cancellation, with timeout. And from my perspective, maybe I'm off base here, but that looks way more like you're actually canceling the underlying task.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, the one thing I would say is, like, I'm not concerned that this is an API people stumble on and use heavily, because especially in the way it's proposed, I mean, I have a hard time finding a way that is more ugly than what's proposed right now, right? People already hate configure await faults, right? But now configure await with new await behavior, open brace, and then it's like you're not really likely to call this on accident, right? Like you're making a very deliberate choice at that point.
I don't know if I agree with that. I feel like if I'm someone who knows just enough about await that I can use it efficiently, but I don't really understand what's going on, and I'm using configure await false everywhere because someone told me that's what I should do. If I see this new overload pop up, I'm going to be like, oh, I can put my cancellation token here. Cool.
Yeah, my answer to that
I think some people will do that.
Yeah,
I mean, we can also we can try and we can ship an analyzer to say, Clippy pops up and says you're passing your cancellation token into configure await, but the task you've got, you're calling await.stream.read async. You should pass your cancellation token in there instead.
I love that idea. I would be okay with this if we had that.
I mean, we should already have the analyzer that says you had a cancellation token and you didn't pass it to it.
We will already warn in that situation. It just won't be warning that you are also passing it into this configure await thing. But maybe seeing that would be enough to move it, or maybe we update the fixer for that to remove it from the configure await if it was passed there instead, or so. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
On that point, there have been asks in this thread from folks to basically provide sort of other overloads that accelerate certain parameters. So, for example, a configure await that only accepts a cancellation token or a timeout. I take it from this conversation that we might want to avoid that approach because it might, offer a less obtuse way to pass a cancellation token to the awaiter.
And we could add it later, but yeah, I kind of agree.
I don't have a strong opinion. For me, the name of the method is the thing that triggers me the most. So the fact that it's configure await, that personally makes me comfortable, regardless of what the arguments are. But I get that other people might differently.
I gotta say, I think this is very non-intuitive. I know that there are a lot of people who want to do this kind of thing, in particular around either a with cancellation type of thing or a with timeout thing. And it just seems like the way we've defined this, as Emo said, is kind of the ugliest way possible. And I realize it's kind of intentional, but I think we want to make this discoverable to some extent, and we've made it almost impossible to discover without somebody. I have a feeling we're going to get a flood of posts on Stack Overflow or somewhere like that that's like, how do I do this? And then it'll be like, here's the one line. And it's like, well, why didn't we just make it discoverable in the first place?
I guess what I'm struggling is why we think this isn't discoverable. I actually don't think it's that ugly. I mean, maybe it's the eye of the beholder, and my eye is very different. But it's spelling out, yes, it is longer, but it's saying I want to configure this await operation, and here is how I'm configuring it.
Yeah, I mean, I know that a lot of ASP developers don't use configure await just because it's often not necessary there. So I can see some people not discovering this, but I would expect the only people that would use this would be the people who already know about configure await. So I don't think that they would have problems finding it. I'm mostly just worried about the newbies having an even larger hurdle to using await.
Yeah, I think that.
If the feedback is we should have accelerator methods that are, bool, comma, cancellation token, I'm fine with that too. I don't have qualms about that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know why we wouldn't just call it with cancellation or with timeout. We're always going to have the potential issue that somebody confuses what's happening and passes the cancellation token to the wrong place. But I don't think there's a way to eliminate that. And I actually don't think it's that big of a problem because most people are simply going to say, if there's a cancellation token as part of the API, their first option is going to be, I passed my cancellation token there, as opposed to hunting for some way external to the API to make it work. And
for what it's worth, if you have exposed this API, then writing a correct with cancellation like method becomes a one-liner because you just express it as an async method.
I don't know. I really struggle with the exposing a with method. I do think it suggests mutation.
Yeah, I agree with Stephen. I think configure await is probably the best option. I would just think if we can do this, hide it extra somewhere in some static methods that aren't an extension on these.
How does a with method imply mutation?
That it's basically saying take this operation and add cancellation to it.
And return a new instance, because that's what C# standardized on for records and what they're going to be doing for value records, presumably when they expose them. But
you're not using that return. You're not concretely grabbing that task and then using it in parallel with the original. You're just saying await blah dot with timeout.
Does task have any methods that change the operation itself?
No.
I mean, so that is kind of what makes me think that with cancellation or with timeout isn't as bad. Given that task doesn't have any methods.
Task has very few methods. No one really calls methods on task other than wait.
Yeah, and I very much disagree that it's better, because with cancellation to me really sounds like I'm affecting the operation itself and not the await. I really don't like that.
Then can we come up with a better name for it instead of kind of hiding it? Feels like what we've done is, because we don't have a good name for it, we've hidden it to try and address that issue. Could we just come up with a better name for it?
I disagree. I think configure await is exactly what it's doing.
Yeah. I mean, one thing we can do to make it slightly less ugly, unless we assume that the list of things on await behavior will be 50 at some point, I actually think it would be better to just have overloads of optionals and then just do the IntelliSense hiding trick, remove optionals if we add more things to it, because then at least the call set is not quite as verbose. To me, what really turns me off here is that when we make people do relatively basic stuff, it's it's basically 3 parentheses in, right? That seems a bit excessive for what amounts to a fairly basic operation. I mean, I also disagree with Corey's concern that this is a super popular API place, because even if you have an optional parameter with 3 or 4 of them that you have to call them with the colon syntax, I think that's sufficient deterrent for people to not just accidentally stumble over that. And if they read something on Stack Overflow that's just plain wrong, well, there's nothing we can do about it, right? Wrong advice will always be wrong advice, and people will take it on face value, and that's going to be the case for most of the stuff we're doing. So I'm more that one why I'm not super concerned about that.
I'd like to disagree with that. I think we should do this, and then consider adding non-struct based overloads for convenience, but that this is really the essence of, and talking with Steve in the past, I feel that that's actually what configure await was supposed to have been originally, was either flags or a struct of, here are all of the options to modify how await is going to work.
Right.
But that he lost in the API review and it got turned into a Boolean. And that this is the way forward. If we add 5 more options, they'll go on here and we'll figure out what convenience overloads to add. But for the code you will have to go through and change the least if you have in my library, we always call configure await with the following in behaviors. You've defined that static once, you pass it, we add more options, you change that, you pass that. I think that we want the struct one, and that configure await is right. In fact, for everyone who doesn't know, configure await does not return a task; it returns an awaitable. Which is where all the whiffs start dying immediately because there's now nothing to bind on anymore. But I think it's this plus convenience overloads, and then we can get into details like I'm upset about the default of continue on captured context and don't know what suppress exceptions does.
Well, to be clear, I'm not proposing overloads. Right? What I'm proposing is just instead of having the struct, you just have default the parameters.
Right, and then when if we add another thing in the next release, that was a forced overload anyway, and we may as well just add the struct. And again, if we add a parameter, and you care about the behavior of that parameter, you have to find every call site and update it in the next release, as opposed to changing the one static struct that you use for, this is how my library does awaitables.
Yeah,
I disagree with that. I think that, first of all, like when you throw all these things in somebody's face, they feel like they need to understand what all these are going to do. Whereas most of the time, I really just want to use one and maybe two of these things, right? The by far most common thing that people are going to want to do here is say, add a cancellation token or add a timeout. And now you've also got the issue that, well, if you add a cancellation token, can you add a cancellation token and a timeout? And does that compose? I mean, I think that it's much easier to use if you have, and again, we can call it configure await with cancellation or something like that, or configure await cancellation or something like that. I don't really care that much about what the name is, but I think I'd much rather say task.configure await cancellation with this token force async than I would task.configure await new await behavior with a bunch of shit that I have to figure out how to set within that.
I would point out that I think that actually needing to set any of these is going to be pretty rare. So it's probably not the worst thing that it's a little ugly to use. I mean, there are certainly use cases, but the vast majority of awaits should probably not care about any of these other than the capture context property.
Okay, I had another question. We have configure await not only on task value task, but also on async enumerable. And we also have with cancellation method there. But my first question is, would all of these apply to async enumerable, or would we ever implement configure await taking await behavior on async enumerable and some other configure awaits that I don't know about that might be affected?
So it's worth pointing out that with cancellation it actually does effectively affect the enumerable in that whatever you pass as the cancellation token there is threaded through. So that's another reason in my mind that it should be that we've used that name for something and we shouldn't use it here.
That's a good point.
But back to the other one, would we implement configure await that takes await behavior on async enumerable?
Potentially.
And would all of these apply?
Yeah, because on async enumerable, all it's doing is whatever you specify for the configure await there is automatically translated to each await that's implicitly used.
Okay.
If we do accept this API, what do we think about changing those sets to inits? Have we used init in an API yet?
Can you use inits and structs?
Pretty sure you can.
I'm pretty sure you can as well.
I don't know if that's a good idea, because say that you wanted to mutate one of these things, the typical way that you would do it is, because it's a value type, you would say var my new instance equals old instance, and then my new instance dot some property equals new value. Doesn't that fail within it because it's not using a constructor syntax?
You have to use the object initializer syntax and put all the constructor bits in braces, which works great for read-only structs, which we recommend for structs anyways.
Right, but like, do you care? Because this one is going to be copied anyway.
If modify a scenario, we'd have to make a copy constructor.
Is there any benefit from making it init, aside from kind of conveying intent?
I mean, there really is not much of a difference, except that you basically force people to use initializer syntax, right? They can't do the normal, like, new and then property blah, and separate statements, right?
Yeah.
Which I think in this case, to me, is kind of equivalent, because presumably when you call configure away, we stash these data away anyway. Like, you're not actually holding onto the reference of the struct, so who cares whether you mutate it after the fact?
Exactly. This is like a one-use struct, right? You use it for this particular task. The value of making it immutable or immutable-ish doesn't seem like there's much there.
Well, I think Tanner's thoughts on this being a read-only struct actually does provide some value.
Especially if we think people are going to create this in statics ever, then they'll likely create it as a static read-only, in which case you end up with weird behavior if the struct is mutable and you try and mutate a value, because it's not going to mutate like you think it does. You want to use the initializer syntax, which is also why we recommend don't use structs, and if you do use structs, make them immutable.
So the suggestion was making it read-only and the setters into inits. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
The value of that is, but I mean, you just make the API slightly harder to use now.
Well, I mean, it's really just our thing of, if you have a struct, if you're adding a new struct, it should be a read-only struct.
I mean, my other question is, where does the struct actually go, right? Because if you put it in literally task, was it system setting tasks? I mean, the namespace only has a handful of types. Like, you, in a certain way, you promote this concept even further by doing that. But that's a different problem, I guess.
So there is value in making this read-only, though, because this struct is not going to be trivially copyable, right? Like, it has too much stuff in it.
Well, I mean, normally what you would expect is that whatever the configured task is that you return has either has individual properties or has just a value of type await behavior. But as soon as you assign it, you're effectively copying it, right?
Yeah, I'm more thinking of the call site of when you call configure await. The difference is, does this get passed by reference or by value?
Yeah, this struct is big enough that no matter what you do, it's going to be passed by reference at the ABI level. If you're not passing it explicitly by reference, then it's by shadow copy.
I mean, depends on who writes it. I imagine Steve would get it down to 2 longs.
Even then, on x86, that's going to be, and on Windows, it's going to be by shadow copy.
Yeah,
fair enough.
It can't be too long, as I've already analyzed the surface, unfortunately.
Cancellation token stores a reference, time span is a long, and then you have a few bits.
I thought time span was an int, so I thought it was 35 bits plus a reference.
It is a long, isn't it? Am I wrong about that?
No, it's a long. You're right. But yeah, it means we have at least 9 bytes in addition to the reference, which
Well, I mean, if time span's a long, I thought it was an int, which is why I thought you could fit it in 2 longs.
It is a long, you could store it as an unsigned integer because that's how timeouts are expressible internally.
Yeah, I think in practice we can get away with an int because we're just going to transform this to milliseconds at some point.
It would be weird if we have a property where when you set it and then get it, it gives you back a different resolution.
That's true. Also, I think we can add more to this as time goes on, so that optimization, we can't count on it long term.
And even if it is milliseconds, we track time in terms of 100 nanosecond ticks, and you very quickly get over the 4 billion marker.
I mean, for what it's worth in task.delay, even though it does accept a time span parameter, that quickly gets converted to milliseconds anyway. So.
Right, but you can't read it back is the difference.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. It could be the case that you set it and then you get back something that is, of lower resolution. But would that be a good compromise?
I don't think we would want to play with games like that, because if as was mentioned earlier, we might add more stuff to this in the future, and now we might blow past the 8 bytes anyway, in addition to the reference, and then what did we actually accomplish?
What are we talking about?
Yeah.
Passing the argument by in or something? What?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, my looking at it, I was already thinking of how big it was going to be, and at when I thought it was too long on Linux, at least, I think it would just pass that as concurrent registers or adjacent registers. But if we packed it in the fields tightly, but it's not worth doing, I guess.
This is probably overly optimistic, but would the JIT inline this inline the configure await call in such a way that it can avoid actually constructing a struct here in most cases?
It can be done in a few places. One of the things that we've done in the past is when we have APIs that take spans, for instance, because the JIT doesn't optimally pass span across an ABI, what we'll do is we'll deconstruct it back into a reft and a length, call an actual workhorse method with those as parameters, mark the original span consuming method as aggressive inlining, and then from the code gen's perspective, there's never any stack spilling going on. Everything is registered, but that's kind of, working around some weirdness in the JIT. And that involves, doing lots of tricks that we're comfortable with doing, but maybe typical developers aren't.
Yeah.
I could be wrong in this. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but my hope is that if you're using this, things are happening that are way more expensive than anything that's happening here. So if you're setting a timeout, like we're going to be creating a timer. If you're setting a cancellation token, we're doing additional allocation, at least for the async completion case. If you're setting suppress exceptions, probably because you're expecting exceptions to be thrown. So my hope is that this level of hyper optimization won't matter. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong.
I think that's probably true in general, but the case where it may not be is the already completed case.
Sure.
And we were considering adding this to value task?
Yeah, we would task and value task.
So we're not doing this. Sorry, so we're not doing this for async disposable than async enumerable?
So we could. I think my preference is, and if we did, like we've already got this, the struct defined, and it would just be the relevant overloads of configure await on those as well. We could do them there now or later if we decided to. My sort of crawl, walk, run mentality is if someone wanted this, this functionality for, say, async enumerable, await for each over an async enumerable is just an expansion into a try catch and a while move next loop. Someone could always do the expansion themselves and then use this on the individual wait. So we're not like blocking anything, but we could certainly make that easier by adding the overloads there too.
All right, and so what I heard earlier is, sorry, so basically the other thing is the signature would still be the same as the existing configure awaits, right? It would still return a configured task available, a configured available task available. And I think what I heard was that we would just take await behavior as is without in.
Actually, it would return a new type of awaitable, called in this case configured cancelable task awaitable, and corresponding awaiter, so it would return a different type.
Why would it be a different type? I thought the existing configured task available and configured value task available for that purpose.
Well, the existing named method is for that purpose, but we don't want like this is any usage of this is the rare case, and we don't want to bloat the common case with a much larger struct.
So what is the type name for those then?
There is an API proposal if you scroll down a bit more.
Oh, I see. I didn't scroll far enough, I guess. Okay. I see. So basically I would have to take all of this stuff here.
Steve, you're the master of the L's. Is one L cancelable the right number of L's?
Cancel, canceller, canceling, cancelable are all one. Cancellation is two.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, I think we need to do something here. I think it's gotten to the point where like the code people have to write without this support, in particular for cancellation timeout, has become just really, really messy. You create a new something and you call await task.whenAny with a task.delay that takes a new cancellation token source that you created, and then you have to remember to dispose that, and you check which one task.whenAny returned. And the boilerplate for that is just really big, and people get it wrong. They forget to dispose the cancellation. They forget to cancel the cancellation token, or they don't pass one into the task delay at all, and then you're leaking timers. So like, it feels like this is really the right time to do something about this. I do believe configure await is the right way to do it from a naming perspective. If later on we find some 1% case where someone really did want to pass around a new task that contained the timeout of the cancellation token as well, we could always add those too. But I do think the 99% case of what we've seen people want this for is just directly awaiting. I care less about whether it's optional parameters to an overload or a struct. I don't think we're going to be adding a ton more to this, but I wouldn't be surprised if over the next few releases another few things trickled in. We've already had a couple issues open for people wanting additional things in there. So that's why I think that sort of logic is why we landed on the struct. If we want to pass it by in, I think that's fine. If we want to expand this now or later for enumerables and disposables, I think that's fine, but I don't think it's critical.
I mean, passing by in isn't really going to save anything, right? Like, you're going to have to expand it when you assign it on the return.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna certainly read everything.
So, I don't like the general putting in public API is probably the wrong answer. Seems to apply here.
It allows you to change.
Putting in if it's not read only would be the wrong thing to do.
Certainly.
Yeah. So one benefit of in is that it allows you to chain, right? So if you have a method that takes in mystruct that calls another method that takes in mystruct, like the runtime can literally just pass the same ref under covers over and over and over. You can't do that with regular by-val semantics.
Yeah, I mean, if we think it's going to buy us something, if we think it's going to buy us something because this is at a fairly low level, then sure. I don't have a strong feeling. It's just in isn't magic. It's going to be an expanded read at some point. And,
is there any particular harm to in, given that it's read-only?
Well, wait, did we decide to make it read-only?
Oh, I thought it was.
The harm with the main harm with in is if it's not read-only, you can easily get into situations where you cause hidden copies. That can partially be solved with mutable structs by marking individual methods as read-only. Likewise, there's sometimes confusing semantics because C# decided to not require in at the call site, meaning you can still call this via like new configure await struct without having to create an explicit value and then pass by in. So you can get into some weird scenarios where you think you're passing a particular thing, but you're actually passing a copy of that.
Right,
And
I
those
forgot
are
we had
really
it.
the only things.
Sorry. Yeah, I forgot we hadn't agreed on read-only because it can be inconvenient.
Well, if it was read-only, and if C# is doing withers for structs in C# 10, then it would be trivial to add proper withers to this struct later if it was read-only.
Mm-hmm. I do have one other concern we haven't talked about, but we're also over time. Emo, should we keep going, or?
And I think we should resolve this because we're very close to it now.
Okay. One other issue I have is specific to the suppress exceptions thing. So basically the suppress exceptions option, which is important because I mean it's something that people have frequently asked us for with tasks in particular. That basically means that someone goes back afterwards to you await task.suppress exceptions, and then you check the task manually afterwards to see if it failed or not, and you do something custom. You usually use it because you want to avoid throwing, and so you want to be able to check manually. That's fine for task. For value task, that one in particular means that we're encouraging you to check the value task after you've already awaited it. And in general, that's a no-no. So we can deal with that by saying, well, suppress exceptions is special, and the implementation won't have actually kind of completed its await on the task. You sort of, it's up to you to call, to get the results or get the exceptions from it. But A, we don't expose a .exception property on value task, and B, the way these APIs are defined, if it's successful and it was a value task of T, it's going to return the result, which means if it's successful, you can't touch it again, but if it's not successful, you should touch it again. I worry that's going to be a problem.
If that's the use case, yeah. I was also going to ask what it does if the T is a non-nullable value type. Just default of T?
Yeah, it would be default of T.
So basically the flow would be you've awaited, and then if my answer is default of T, in value task you still don't know if that was because it succeeded or not, and asking the question is violating the contract.
Right. So that suppress exception on value task is an issue.
I mean, the easy answer is if they pass suppress exception true, then they've defeated value task and you as task it internally.
That's not actually an easy answer because that as task internally consumes the value task completely, then they definitely can't use it.
Meaning if they, right, because they have a struct which has the original reference to the completion source.
Right.
Yeah. And then saying you can't say suppress exceptions true to value task makes the struct less reusable, which means we didn't want it.
And so the reason I bring this up is even though I was promoting the struct route, in which case we would be sharing the same struct between task and value task, if we didn't go the struct route and we instead went the just have a bunch of optional parameters, the configure await we exposed for value task could just not have suppress exceptions. That could just not be an option.
And if you wanted suppress exceptions, you have to as task it yourself.
Right.
Yeah. That is. That switches me from the struct to the flat calls.
I mean, to me, the other question is like, ignore the configure await call. Like, do we expect people to use the await behavior type anywhere else, or do we generally expect people to literally just new it up to call configure await?
I think it would be new it up to call configure await.
Yeah, because at that point it just seems like we really kind of invent our own parameter passing.
Well, so again, my feeling on it was if you do the same thing a lot, you would have one static read-only of this is the behavior I want everywhere. I don't want to see a 900 character call to every await. I want to be able to do, await something dot configure await s underscore await behavior, right? And so to me that seemed it's hard to figure out what you were doing initially, but once you understand it, it's probably what you want. That most things in your library or at least in your class are probably going to want to do things in a similar way. This is probably really only true if you're trying to do, force async or whatever. And so maybe you have like 3 different options you've predefined, but that you're making it easier to read because you've named the thing instead of like, great, this took 6 lines of code because I hit my terminal length with every single one of these property names.
Yeah, I would have probably just defined another extension method over task or value task and do basically what you just described in there. But
yeah,
I mean, because I think people who take offense to configure await also take offense to the longness of the method name itself. So I've seen people doing configure await false as an extension method so they can save like 20 characters because they use it freaking everywhere. But I think based on what Steven said, I think the idea is you would not use these advanced options on every single async await. You would do it like in very specific places where probably you want very specific behavior, right? Where maybe the stashed await behavior doesn't help you because, well, there's a particular cancellation token, a particular timer that you got from an argument which you now have to use, right? In which case you probably have to, I think the best you can do is now define an extension method that only takes these 2 or something. But
yeah, once it's custom behaviors, like each call is either going to just use the classic configure await false or is going to have different values for each of these, then to me the struct argument goes out the window because reusability across multiple calls was the benefit it had to me.
Yeah, to me the big argument of not using the await behavior struct is so we don't have to put it in the task namespace because it's relatively clean and it seems like it's a utilitarian type that we put on everybody's face. The only downside with that option is now we have basically 4 configure await methods, not even thinking of the
parameters by then they start causing a because they all become pass by reference. Basically, if you get over 5, I think it is, on all platforms.
I mean, it kind of depends on how we do that, right? I mean, there's nothing really preventing us from having specialized overloads that only take, the 3 things that we think are more popular, right?
There's an interesting conversation in the chat about potentially using the term abandon when passing a cancellation token in this context.
I still don't understand.
Yeah, I don't know what it would mean to say await some method called .abandon and then a token. Like that is not obvious code to me.
I personally, I'm almost certain that people will misunderstand / abuse this code anyways.
I mean, that's a given, yeah.
But then again, I'm not sure that naming it abandon would prevent that fully.
No, I think to me, to a certain extent, the problem that we have here is intrinsic, right? Because there's a difference between the operation and the awaiting set operation, and I think that's just, we can't really hide that entirely. And I think to Steven's earlier point, I think we have this established configure await terminology, which is the best attempt we had, but I don't know, to me renaming a cancellation token into something else is just, you make it even harder to describe what you're doing there.
I mean, the type would still be a cancellation token. You'd be renaming the parameter name.
Sure, but like that's kind of the same thing, right? You just rename the concept now, but like, is that, like, do people understand what the new terminology is supposed to convey? I don't think so. And I think that's kind of the intrinsic problem space here. So, I mean, now we are getting into, fairly overtime territory. Like, are we okay with strapping the type, or do we think there's something else you want to look into? Like, I mean, the one downside of strapping the type is that you definitely don't get in behavior, right? At that point, you basically have to either have specialized overloads or just live with the fact that you pass 12 arguments all the time, right? I mean, I kind of buy Steven's argument that some of the operations here are so expensive that it probably doesn't matter. But like, you certainly make it now really hard to do the optimization if we ever wanted to. I mean, of course, we can still add the type later, but then, we created a mess.
Based on Steve pointing out the difficulty of suppress exceptions with value task, and now the type can't be used across the two. I mean, we can make two types, but I think that I'm now in favor of it's just parameters, and we make the overloads as we see fit for a combination of perf and usability.
I mean, the one downside is that, I mean, from an I don't know, like if we think most behaviors will always be applicable to everybody, I'm also okay with just saying configure wait on value task just throws when you set suppress exceptions to true immediately and says, sorry, you can't do that with value task. Because now the problem is if we add new things, we just have to remember that we have to add them to 3 other overloads, right? So it cuts both ways, right? Like if you do customize, then you have to consistently customize. If you say like, well, there's only ever one thing that might not work, then maybe just modeling them as exceptions is probably the easier way of doing it.
Yeah, and I guess throwing for, I'm sorry, this argument doesn't make sense in context is fine.
But yeah, I mean, to me, the biggest reason for not having the type is just we don't have to have the type in the namespace. But that's really the only, and I think the call type might be slightly cleaner depending on how you call it, but it's not really a huge thing. So are there any takers here, or do we mark this as needs work and just capture the nodes we have so far, or do we think we are at the point where we can make a decision one way or the other?
I don't think we're anywhere near making a decision, but I don't know what the work is other than we talk about this again and spend another hour debating it.
I mean, might be the right answer, right? If people on the call think, should I have to sleep over that before I have an opinion, that's fine. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily wasting people's time.
Yeah, I just don't feel that we have anything. I don't feel that we have a consensus, and I don't feel that we have anything as a follow-up. So needs work is complicated. We're just not done debating yet.
I think that's reasonable.
So I think we leave it as ready for review, and it's just where we start next week.
Or maybe even a dedicated session 4 if we've got other issues.
Yeah, honestly, I did not check the details here. I should have probably predicted that this is taking a long time. But let me just paste in what I have so far. I mean, my notes are pretty sporadic right now, but like I feel like we talked over most of it. Was basically just this discussion, right? I think this is one thing I should capture here is that it seems value tasks and tasks might differ in what they can support. The same might be true for other async interfaces, if we had ever cared. Alright, and I think that's it for today. Alright, then I think backlog-wise we're doing fairly well. So see you next week then.
Thanks, Simo.
So are we just picking this up as the first issue next week, or are we making a dedicated time for it?
Yeah, I think we probably should book an hour. So like what I'm thinking is like let's use the first hour for backlog and then the second hour for just this issue.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Any dissent, Eric, Steve? You think it's more than an hour left?
That's good.
Okay.
Alrighty, then see you guys next week.
We just add thanks to Eric for going many rounds on this one.
Hey. We'll get there.
All right. I see you then next week. Bye bye.
Bye bye.